February 1945, Saipan. The cave smells of earth and fear. 23 Japanese women press themselves against the volcanic rock, their breathing shallow, their children's whimpers muffled against trembling shoulders. Outside, the jungle canopy filters afternoon light into fractured gold, and somewhere beyond the green wall American voices drift through the humid air, low, cautious, incomprehensible. The women have heard the stories. They know what comes next. For weeks, the Japanese garrison command had prepared them with warnings delivered in measured tones and official certainty. The American Marines are monsters who torture, mutilate, desecrate. Better to die with honor than submit to such fate. Several women clutch grenades given to them by retreating soldiers, Type 97 hand grenades, each weighing less than a pound, each capable of ending everything in a single merciful instant. One woman, Yoshiko Nakamura, aged 24, holds her infant daughter against her chest. The child is quiet now, too weak from hunger to cry. Yoshiko's fingers trace the grooved surface of the grenade hidden in her kimono. She remembers the instructions: pull the pin, count to 3, hold tight. She remembers the officer's words, spoken with fatherly concern. The Americans will violate you. They will murder your children before your eyes. You must choose dignity. Her hand trembles. The voices outside grow closer. Through a crack in the cave entrance, she glimpses movement, olive drab uniforms, the glint of metal. This is the moment. This is where 23 lives should end. But something happens that no propaganda film, no military briefing, no whispered nightmare has prepared them for. The Mariana Islands campaign had transformed Saipan into a killing ground, where ideology collided with reality in ways that would reshape the Pacific War's final chapter. By February 1945, the island had been under American control for 7 months, yet the mountains and caves still harbored thousands of Japanese civilians who had fled during the June invasion. These were not soldiers. They were schoolteachers and merchants' wives, farmers' daughters and elderly grandmothers, dragged into the imperial sphere when Japan fortified Saipan in 1944, transforming this sugar cane island into what Tokyo called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The civilian population had swelled to nearly 30,000 by the time the Marines landed, and when the American bombardment began, these people found themselves trapped between two crushing forces: the U.S. military advance and their own government's apocalyptic indoctrination. The Japanese military command understood, with cold precision, that Saipan's loss would place American B-29 bombers within striking range of Tokyo itself. Every civilian became a potential casualty not of American fire, but of Japanese strategy. In the weeks before the invasion, officers moved through civilian shelters distributing grenades and cyanide, conducting what they termed instruction sessions on honorable death. Women attended mandatory lectures where they learned that American soldiers were subhuman creatures motivated purely by savage lust and bloodthirst. The propaganda drew from racist caricatures that had poisoned Japanese media for years, images of Americans as gangsters and rapists, barely restrained by their weak democratic government. Military police ensured attendance at these sessions. Refusal meant collaboration. Doubt meant treachery. By the time the Marines fought their way inland in late June 1944, Saipan's civilian population faced an impossible calculus. American loudspeakers broadcasting surrender appeals in Japanese competed with the memory of those mandatory lectures. Underground radio broadcasts from Tokyo described American atrocities in graphic detail. Most invented, some exaggerated from isolated incidents, all designed to make death seem preferable to capture. For civilians huddled in caves and jungle ravines, every decision became existential. And when Marine patrols approached their hiding places, many chose the grenade over the unknown. The results traumatized the Marines who witnessed them. Corporal David Cutter, who landed with the 2nd Marine Division, would later write in his journal, "We called out in Japanese, telling them we had food and water, that they'd be safe. Sometimes they'd answer by throwing their children off the cliffs first, then jumping themselves. We'd stand there, helpless, watching mothers kill their bobbies because they believed we were demons. At Marpi Point, the island's northern cliffs, hundreds of Japanese civilians leaped to their deaths onto the rocks below, entire families holding hands as they jumped. Marine photographers captured the aftermath, images so disturbing that military censors initially suppressed them, fearing they would damage morale or complicate the careful narrative of liberation. The Marines had come to Saipan expecting to fight soldiers. Instead, they found themselves trying to prevent mass suicide among people who had been taught that American kindness was the cruelest lie of all. But the Marines adapted, because the alternative was unthinkable. By February 1945, 7 months into the occupation, U.S. forces had developed protocols specifically designed to coax terrified civilians from hiding without triggering the suicide reflex. Japanese-American linguists from the Military Intelligence Service became crucial to these efforts. Men like Sergeant Ben Takemoto, who had grown up in California and volunteered for service even as his family remained in internment camps. These linguists understood not just the language, but the psychological framework the imperial military had constructed. They knew which words would trigger defensive panic and which might create a momentary pause, a crack in the ideological armor through which truth could seep. The protocols emphasized patience above all else. When Marines located a cave or dugout sheltering civilians, they established a perimeter but did not advance. They positioned Japanese-American linguists within speaking distance but not threatening proximity. The linguists would call out repeatedly, their voices steady and unhurried, explaining that the war was over for Saipan, that food and medical care waited, that mothers and children would be kept together. They described specific details: the taste of rice, the availability of clean water, the presence of Japanese civilian medical staff at the camps. Details mattered because abstractions like safety and freedom had been stripped of meaning by propaganda. But the smell of cooking rice, the promise of medicine for sick children, the assurance that families would not be separated, these concrete offerings sometimes penetrated where ideology had built walls. The woman Yashiko, pressed against the volcanic rock with her infant daughter, had been hiding for 2 weeks in this particular cave system. Her husband had been a clerk in the island's sugar company administration before the war consumed everything. She had last seen him in June, during the chaos of the American landing, when Japanese soldiers ordered all able-bodied men to defensive positions. He had kissed their daughter's forehead, told Yashiko to stay alive, and disappeared into the smoke and thunder. Since then, she had survived on stolen sweet potatoes and rainwater, moving between caves as Marine patrols swept through the jungle, gathering other refugees, women whose husbands had vanished, elderly men too frail to retreat with the garrison, children orphaned by the invasion's initial bombardment. They had expected death for so long that survival had become unfamiliar, almost embarrassing. Each morning that the sun rose felt like a reprieve that couldn't last. The grenades the soldiers had given them represented a kind of certainty, a final control over fate in a world where everything else had been stripped away. When the American voices first echoed into their cave system 3 days earlier, several women had immediately prepared to pull the pins. But Yashiko had whispered, "Wait, wait," unsure why except that her daughter's eyes were still open, still watching, still suggesting that the world might contain one more possibility. Now that possibility stood at the cave entrance in the form of Sergeant Ben Takemoto, who spoke Japanese with a California accent and carried no rifle, only a canteen and a canvas bag. The women could see him through the cave mouth, young, perhaps 25, his Marine uniform crisp despite the jungle humidity. He called into the darkness, his voice echoing off stone, "We have hot food, rice with vegetables, clean water, medical supplies for the children who are sick. You are safe now. The fighting is finished here." The standard propaganda response would be, "Lies, all lies, tricks to draw us out for slaughter." But Sergeant Takemoto did something the propaganda hadn't prepared them for. He set down his canteen, withdrew from his canvas bag a small metal container, opened it and began to eat. Rice with what looked like meat and beans. He ate slowly, visibly, taking deliberate bites and pausing to drink from the canteen. He described what he was eating. "This is sea-ration ham and lima beans, mixed with rice we cooked this morning. It's not as good as my mother's cooking, but it's hot and filling. If you come out, we have enough for everyone, including the children." Yashiko watched this performance with confusion that gradually shaded into something else. If the Americans intended to kill them, why this elaborate theater? Why would this soldier, so young, so human in his movements, sit at a cave mouth eating rice and talking about his mother's cooking? The grenade in her kimono suddenly felt heavier, more concrete, a fact demanding acknowledgement. She looked at the other women. Most stared at the cave floor, resigned to waiting until the Americans either left or forced entry. But two of the younger women, both in their early 20s, watched the sergeant with tentative curiosity. Takemoto continued his vigil for hours. He never raised his voice. He never demanded. He simply talked, describing the civilian camp where Japanese refugees received food, shelter, and medical care. He mentioned details that propaganda couldn't have faked. The camp had doctors who spoke Japanese. The Red Cross had delivered supplies. Families were housed together in tents rather than separated. He explained that some civilians had already volunteered to help with camp administration, that there was a school for children, that the American military command had ordered Marines to treat all civilians with respect under pain of court-martial. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Takemoto's voice took on a different quality, less official, more personal. He talked about his own family, his parents who ran a grocery store in Sacramento, how he had grown up between two worlds, Japanese at home and American everywhere else. He said, "I understand that you've been taught Americans are cruel. Some people are cruel in every country, but most of the Marines here are boys from farms and small towns. They have mothers and sisters. They see your children and think of their own families. They don't want to hurt you. They want to go home. We all want this war to end so we can return to the people we love." Inside the cave, Yashiko felt something crack. Not her resolve, that had been eroding for days, but the ideological framework that had made death seem preferable to surrender. The sergeant's words contained no grand promises of liberation or democracy. He offered only small, verifiable truths. Food exists, water exists, medicine exists, and your children can have them if you walk into the light. The symbolism of that light felt almost too obvious, too cinematic, and yet there it was, afternoon sun filtering through jungle canopy, illuminating the cave mouth where a young man sat patiently describing his mother's cooking. One of the younger women, Emiko, aged 19, moved first. She had been holding a grenade for 3 days, her fingers cramped around the safety lever. Now she set it down carefully, stood on shaking legs, and walked toward the entrance. Yashiko's breath caught. The other women tensed, expecting the crack of gunfire, the scream. Instead, Sergeant Takemoto stood slowly, hands visible, empty, and said in gentle Japanese, "You are very brave. Please, sit here in the shade. I have water." Emiko reached the entrance and stopped, blinking in the light. Takemoto handed her the canteen. She drank, her body rigid with anticipation of violence that never came. After several long seconds, she began to cry, not from fear but from the rupture of expectation and reality. The sergeant guided her to sit on a smooth rock, then called in English to the Marines positioned behind the tree line. One civilian emerged. "Female, late teens, dehydrated but mobile. Hold your positions." Yashiko watched this transaction with her daughter pressed against her shoulder. The child had begun to whimper, sensing her mother's trembling. Other women in the cave whispered urgently, some insisting this was a trap, that violence would come after trust was established, that the grenades remained their only true option. But Yashiko found herself calculating a different math. If the Americans wanted them dead, they could seal the cave and toss in explosives, or flood it with gasoline and fire, or simply wait for starvation to finish the job. The sergeant's patience, His vulnerability sitting exposed at the cave mouth suggested something else. She stood, still holding her daughter, and walked forward. The light hit her like a physical force after days in the cave's darkness. Sergeant Takemoto turned toward her, his expression neutral, professional, but his eyes betraying relief. He said, "Welcome. You've made the right choice. What is your daughter's name?" The question nearly broke her. When had anyone last asked her daughter's name? She whispered, "Hana. Her name is Hana, and she is 8 months old, and she is very hungry." Takemoto smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face from official mask to human being. He opened another canvas bag and withdrew a small tin of condensed milk. "We have this for the bobbies. It's sweet and nutritious. May I show you how to prepare it?" Within 20 minutes, all 23 women emerged from the cave. Some came in groups, supporting elderly companions. Others came alone, moving as if through a dream. The Marines maintained their perimeter, rifles lowered, watching with expressions Yashiko couldn't interpret: relief, sadness, something that looked like shame. Takemoto processed each woman with quiet efficiency, asking names, checking for injuries, distributing water and food. He explained that trucks would arrive within the hour to transport them to the civilian camp, that medical personnel would examine the children, that they would receive clean clothes and bedding. One Marine, a corporal who looked barely 20, approached Yashiko with a canteen extended. His Japanese was broken, heavily accented. "For baby, water clean, safe." Yashiko accepted the canteen, expecting, even now, even after everything, that some violence would follow. Instead, the corporal simply nodded and stepped back. She gave Hana water, and her daughter drank desperately, some of the liquid spilling down her chin. The Marine watched with visible distress, then turned to Takemoto and spoke rapidly in English. Takemoto translated, "Corporal Davis wants to know if your daughter needs immediate medical attention. He says the truck should arrive in 30 minutes, but if she's in danger, he'll radio for a medical evacuation immediately." Yashiko stared at this young American who was so concerned for her daughter's welfare that he was offering to divert military resources for one Japanese infant. The cognitive dissonance was so severe it felt physical, like vertigo. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed for months, collapsed under the weight of this simple gesture. She managed to whisper, "30 minutes is acceptable. Thank you." The Marines had constructed what they called civilian processing stations throughout Saipan's interior, temporary installations designed to transition refugees from hiding to the relative safety of organized camps. The women were transported in covered trucks, accompanied by Takemoto and 2 other Japanese-American linguists who maintained a steady commentary, explaining each step. "We're driving to the western coast. The camp is near Charan Kanoa. The ride will take 40 minutes. You'll see other Japanese civilians there. No one will harm you." Yashiko sat in the truck bed with Hana clutched against her chest, watching the jungle give way to devastated landscape, shell craters, burned-out buildings, twisted metal that had once been part of the island's sugar industry infrastructure. Other women wept quietly. Some sat in stunned silence. Emiko, the first to emerge, kept touching her own arms as if confirming she remained solid, real, alive. The camp at Charan Kanoa shattered any remaining illusions the propaganda had constructed. It sprawled across several acres, neat rows of canvas tents, a central administrative building, a medical facility marked with red crosses, and hundreds of Japanese civilians moving freely within the perimeter. Children played near a water distribution point. Elderly men sat in the shade comparing stories. Women hung laundry on lines strung between tents. The scene was so utterly ordinary, so fundamentally human, that it rendered meaningless every nightmare scenario the imperial military had described. A Japanese woman in her 50s, wearing a clean dress and Red Cross armband, met them at the intake station. She introduced herself as Nurse Tanaka, a civilian employee who had volunteered to help manage the camp. She spoke with brisk kindness. "Welcome. You are safe now. We will process your information, give you clean clothes, provide medical examinations for anyone who needs them, and assign you to family tents. If you are searching for relatives, we maintain a registry. Many families have reunited here. Yashiko's intake processing took less than 30 minutes. An American doctor examined Hana with gentle efficiency, diagnosed mild malnutrition and dehydration, prescribed supplemental feeding, and demonstrated how to mix the powdered milk formula they provided. A clerk recorded Yashiko's name and her husband's name in a large ledger. In case he is found among the remaining holdouts, the clerk explained. They issued her 2 changes of clothes, blankets, a mosquito net, and assigned her to a tent she would share with 3 other young mothers. That night, lying on a canvas cot with Hana finally sleeping peacefully beside her, Yashiko tried to process the day's ruptures. The American Marines had not tortured her. They had not violated her. They had not murdered her daughter. Instead, they had offered food, water, medical care, basic human necessities delivered without ceremony or condition. The grenade she had carried for weeks now resided in a collection bin at the camp entrance, surrendered along with dozens of others as refugees realized they would not need final solutions after all. But the psychological transformation required more than one day's evidence. Trust is not built through single gestures, no matter how dramatic. It accumulates slowly, through the steady accretion of small confirmations that the new reality will hold. In the days following their emergence, Yashiko and the other women watched the Marines with wary attention, cataloging behaviors, searching for the crack in the facade where the promised violence would finally emerge. It never did. Instead, they witnessed 1,000 small interactions that reinforced the initial impossible truth. They saw Marines playing with Japanese children, using exaggerated hand gestures to communicate across the language barrier. They watched American medics treat elderly Japanese civilians with the same urgency they showed for their own wounded. They observed the courts-martial conducted against 2 Marines who had stolen food from civilian supplies, swift military justice that demonstrated the American command's seriousness about protecting refugees. Corporal Thomas Henderson, assigned to camp security, became something of a fixture in Yashiko's section. He was 21, from Iowa, and he had learned a handful of Japanese phrases from the linguists. Each morning he would pass by the family tents, calling out "Ohio gozaimasu" in his terrible accent, making the children laugh. He carried candy in his pockets, Tootsie Rolls and hard caramel, which he distributed with solemn ceremony, as if bestowing medals. The children learned to recognize his approach and would run to meet him, hands outstretched, calling "Mr. Henderson, candy please." One afternoon, Yashiko watched Henderson play catch with a group of Japanese boys using a baseball he'd produced from somewhere. The game was chaotic. The boys had never seen baseball before, but Henderson's patience was infinite. He demonstrated throwing, catching, batting, running bases marked by stones. The boys' laughter carried across the camp, a sound that had been absent for months. Yashiko found herself crying without quite understanding why, except that laughter seemed like an artifact from another world, and its return suggested that world might still be accessible. The symbolism of food became central to the camp's daily reality. 3 times a day, the Americans distributed rations: rice, vegetables, canned meat, fruit when available. The portions were generous by wartime standards, more than most refugees had eaten in months. The quality varied, but the consistency did not. Food arrived on schedule every day without interruption. This reliability became its own form of communication. In the imperial military culture, deprivation had been framed as honorable, a demonstration of spiritual strength. Soldiers survived on meager rations and were expected to endure without complaint. The American abundance, their casual distribution of supplies that seemed inexhaustible, represented not just material difference but philosophical opposition. Private James Martinez, who worked in the camp's supply depot, once tried to explain American logistics to Sergeant Takemoto, who translated for a group of curious refugees. Back home, Martinez said, we have factories that run 24 hours a day producing food, uniforms, vehicles, weapons. We have trains that carry supplies across the entire continent. We have ships, hundreds of ships carrying cargo across the Pacific. The United States hasn't been bombed. Our cities still stand. Our industrial capacity is untouched. We can supply this camp indefinitely, and it barely registers as a line item in the military budget. Takemoto translated carefully, watching the refugees' faces as they absorbed this information. The scale Martinez described seemed fantastical, like children's stories about magical kingdoms. Japan had been bombed, starved, driven to the edge of collapse. The imperial government had demanded civilians donate metal for the war effort, had rationed rice to near-starvation levels, had mobilized every resource toward military survival. The idea that America possessed such surplus abundance that feeding thousands of enemy civilians represented barely a footnote challenged every assumption about relative power and destiny. Yoshiko asked through Takemoto, "Why do you feed us so much? We are your enemies." Martinez looked uncomfortable with the question. He conferred with Takemoto, then answered slowly, "Because you're human beings. Because your children are hungry. Because we don't make war on civilians, and when civilians get caught in war zones, we have a responsibility to help them. That's what we believe anyway. That's what America is supposed to be about." The words sounded naive, almost childish, especially filtered through translation. But the food arrived anyway, every day, exactly as promised. And gradually, the refugees began to accept that perhaps American naivete was more functional than Japanese cynicism, that a system which prioritized feeding enemy children might possess strengths that transcended military doctrine. By late March 1945, Yoshiko had begun working in the camp school, a voluntary position teaching Japanese language and basic mathematics to children who had lost months of education to war and flight. The school operated in a large tent, with chalkboards salvaged from Saipan's destroyed Japanese schools and supplies provided by the American Red Cross. Yoshiko found unexpected comfort in routine. Wake, feed Hana, teach from 9 to 2, return to the tent, prepare dinner, sleep. The structure provided framework for processing trauma, creating small pockets of normalcy within the larger dislocation. One morning in early April, an American officer visited the school, a Captain Robert Fitzgerald, the Marine liaison to civilian affairs. He walked through the tent with Nurse Tanaka, observing the lessons, occasionally asking questions through Takemoto. When he reached Yoshiko's corner, where she was teaching basic arithmetic to 6-year-olds, he paused to watch. After the lesson, he approached and spoke through Takemoto. "Captain Fitzgerald wants to know if you have everything you need for teaching. Books, supplies, anything that would help the children learn more effectively." Yoshiko considered the question carefully. The truth was, they needed everything: proper textbooks, more chalkboards, paper for students to practice writing. But requesting resources from the occupying military felt complicated, implying a collaboration that might be judged harshly later if later ever came. She finally said, "The children would benefit from reading materials in Japanese. Stories, history, anything to keep their minds active." Fitzgerald listened to the translation, nodded, and made notes in a small book he carried. 3 weeks later, a shipment arrived. 30 Japanese-language books collected from somewhere, captured supplies perhaps, or procured through diplomatic channels. They included children's stories, basic history texts, and poetry collections. Fitzgerald presented them to the school with no ceremony, just a simple statement through Takemoto. "For the children, education is important even during war." Yoshiko accepted the books with a bow, then asked the question that had been troubling her. Why does America care whether Japanese children receive education? Fitzgerald's answer came slowly, as if he was choosing words carefully. Because educated children build better futures. Because literacy and learning are human rights that transcend nationality. Because we're fighting this war, ultimately, to preserve the idea that every person deserves dignity and opportunity. If we fail to extend that principle to children, even enemy children, then what exactly are we fighting for? The idealism sounded absurd against the backdrop of total war, of firebombing campaigns that would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in the coming months, of atomic weapons that would soon reduce cities to shadows and ash. And yet here, in this specific moment, on this specific island, those principles translated into 30 Japanese books delivered to a tent school for refugee children. The disconnect between imperial-scale violence and local-scale mercy defined the war's fundamental incoherence. As spring progressed into summer, the character of the camp shifted. Initial survival urgency gave way to longer-term adjustment. Refugees formed committees to address community concerns. The Americans established a civilian council with limited self-governance authority. Japanese civilians began working in various camp operations: kitchen staff, medical assistants, maintenance crews, positions that provided both purpose and small wages. The camp economy developed its own logic, with trades and informal markets emerging despite official regulations. Yashiko noticed changes in herself that felt both liberating and disorienting. She no longer woke expecting death. She could let Hana play outside the tent without constant vigilance. She conversed with other refugees without the paranoid calculation that had characterized life under Japanese military authority, where every word might be reported, every doubt interpreted as disloyalty. The absence of fear created space for other emotions: grief for her missing husband, anger at the propaganda that had nearly killed her, and her daughter, tentative hope that some form of future remained possible. In July, the registry clerk found Yashiko during lunch and informed her that a Japanese prisoner of war, recently captured from a holdout group in the northern mountains, had identified himself as her husband. The clerk provided no details, just a location: the military POW compound several miles north, and instructions for requesting a visit. Yashiko's world tilted. For 13 months she had assumed him dead, had conducted private mourning rituals, had tried to imagine life as a widow in whatever post-war reality emerged. Now, suddenly, he existed again, alive somewhere beyond the camp's perimeter. The visit required coordination through multiple layers of American military bureaucracy: requests filed, approvals granted, transportation arranged. 2 weeks passed before Yashiko found herself in a military truck, accompanied by Takemoto and a Marine guard, driving to the POW facility. Hana sat on her lap, now 13 months old, beginning to form words, no longer the starving infant from the cave. Yashiko had no idea what to expect. Would her husband recognize their daughter? Would he condemn Yashiko for surrendering? Would he even be the same man she remembered? The POW compound occupied a former Japanese military installation, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but otherwise surprisingly open. Japanese prisoners moved freely within the perimeter, playing cards, tending small gardens, attending educational lectures. Yashiko was processed through a visitor checkpoint and led to a meeting area: picnic tables under shade structures, several other Japanese families already gathered for their own reunions. And then he was there. Thinner, certainly, his face weathered by months of jungle survival, but unmistakably her husband. He saw her and stopped, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, joy, and something that looked like shame. He approached slowly, then faster, and then they were holding each other while Hana, confused by this stranger, began to cry. They had 30 minutes. They sat at one of the picnic tables, under American supervision but given privacy to speak. Yashiko's husband, his name was Kenji, told his story in fragments. He had survived the initial invasion by fleeing into the mountains with other stragglers from his labor battalion. They had hidden for months, surviving on stolen supplies and foraged food, convinced that Japanese reinforcements would eventually arrive to liberate the island. When reinforcements never came, when starvation became unbearable, when several members of their group died from disease and injury. Kenji had finally convinced his companions to surrender. "We expected execution," he said quietly. "The officers had told us the Americans would torture prisoners, that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. But we were dying anyway slowly, and at least execution would be quick." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, they gave us food and medical care. They housed us better than our own military had. They established classes where we could learn English, vocational skills. It felt like a trap, all this kindness, all this comfort preparing us for some final cruelty. But months passed and the cruelty never came." Yashiko told her story: the cave, the grenade, Takemoto's patient vigil, the camp's impossible normalcy. They compared experiences, trying to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had lived. Kenji said, "The propaganda lied about everything. American material strength, yes, but that we knew. What they lied about was American character. They told us Americans were weak, decadent, individualistic to the point of social collapse. But the Marines, I've observed, are disciplined, organized, and they care for each other in ways that seem," he struggled for words, "in ways that seem to make them stronger, not weaker. Their democracy isn't weakness. It's a different form of strength." The observation crystallized something Yashiko had been sensing, but hadn't articulated. The American system, its abundance, its bureaucratic inefficiency, its casual mixing of military personnel and civilians, its emphasis on individual rights even during total war, all the features Japanese propaganda had mocked as fatal flaws, actually seemed to generate resilience and adaptability. The Marines who guarded the camp maintained discipline without brutality. The logistics system that fed thousands of refugees never failed despite operating across thousands of miles of ocean. The democratic principles that Captain Fitzgerald had described translated into practical policies that prioritized human welfare, even for enemy populations. Before their time ended, Kenji held Hana, who had finally stopped crying and was regarding this new person with solemn curiosity. He said, "She won't remember any of this, the war, the fear, the cave. She'll grow up in whatever world comes after, and maybe that world will be better than what we knew before. The Americans say they want to rebuild Japan as a democracy, that they'll help with reconstruction rather than simply extracting tribute. I don't know if I believe that. But if it's true, if they actually follow through on their principles, then maybe our daughter will live in a country where propaganda doesn't drive people to suicide, where abundance isn't reserved for the military elite, where questioning authority isn't treason." The guard announced their time was concluded. Yashiko and Kenji held each other once more, and Kenji kissed Hana's forehead just as he had 13 months earlier before vanishing into the smoke. This time, though, the separation felt temporary. The Americans had explained that POWs would eventually be repatriated to Japan, that families would be reunited during that process, that bureaucracy rather than violence would determine their futures. The promise felt fragile, dependent on continued American victory and commitment to stated principles. But it was more than they had expected, more, in fact, than seemed possible back in that cave where death had felt certain. On the drive back to the civilian camp, Takemoto asked Yashiko how she was feeling. She considered the question carefully before answering: "Grateful, confused, angry at those who lied to us. Hopeful maybe, though that feels dangerous." She paused. "What happens to us after the war ends?" Takemoto's answer was characteristically honest. "I don't know. The official policy is repatriation, sending Japanese civilians back to Japan once hostilities cease. But Japan is devastated. The cities are burning. Food supplies are collapsing. You might return to find your home destroyed, your community scattered. The Americans will provide reconstruction aid, at least that's what Washington promises, but rebuilding will take years, maybe decades." He looked at Hana, sleeping now against Yashiko's shoulder. "Your daughter will grow up in a different Japan than the one you knew. Whether that's better or worse depends on choices people make. American choices, Japanese choices, choices about what kind of society to build from the ruins." The conversation stayed with Yashiko through the summer as the war ground toward its apocalyptic conclusion. News filtered into the camp in fragments: Germany's surrender in May, the continued firebombing of Japanese cities, the Soviet Union's entry into the Pacific War, and finally, in early August, something the American command could barely explain: two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, obliterated by weapons of incomprehensible power. The camp descended into stunned silence as refugees processed the implications. The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The empire had fallen. The announcement came on August 15th, delivered through loudspeakers in Japanese and English. Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice, tinny and distant, informed his subjects that they must endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. The Americans had won. The cost had been total. Everything that followed would be reconstruction. Yashiko sat outside her tent listening to the broadcast with a dozen other refugees. When it ended, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, an elderly man who had lost his entire family during the invasion said quietly, "We survived." It wasn't celebration. It wasn't relief. It was simple acknowledgement of the statistical miracle. They had lived through an experience designed to kill them, and now they faced the burden of continuing in a world that had been fundamentally transformed. In the weeks after surrender, the camp's purpose shifted from wartime necessity to transition planning. The Americans established repatriation schedules, coordinated with Japanese authorities who were themselves operating under occupation, and began the enormous logistical challenge of returning hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians to their homeland. Yashiko received her repatriation notice in October. She and Hana would be transported to Japan in early November, landing at a port that would be determined by ship availability and occupation priorities. Before departure, Captain Fitzgerald organized a farewell ceremony, an awkward, well-intentioned event where Marines and civilians exchanged brief speeches about hope for future peace. Fitzgerald spoke through Takemoto about America's commitment to helping Japan rebuild, about the importance of democracy and human rights, about his own hope that former enemies might become friends. Several Japanese civilians responded with carefully diplomatic expressions of gratitude, their words navigating the complex space between genuine appreciation for survival and unresolved anger at the violence that had necessitated that survival. Yashiko didn't speak at the ceremony, but afterward she sought out Corporal Henderson, the Iowa farm boy who had played with the children and distributed candy. She said through Takemoto, "Thank you for being kind to us. Thank you for treating my daughter as a child rather than an enemy. I don't know how to reconcile that kindness with everything else that happened, but I will remember it." Henderson looked embarrassed, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He said, "I just did what seemed right, ma'am. Those kids didn't start this war. None of you did. Seemed wrong to punish people for their government's decisions." He paused, then added, "I hope you find your home still standing. I hope Japan gets rebuilt into something better. I hope," he stopped, unable to articulate what he hoped, perhaps because the possibilities seemed too vast and too fragile. The ship that carried Yash,